Good. Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks, Jeff, and thank you all for having me and for listening. I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction, not looking at deception detection or misinformation, but instead looking at moral judgments of deception. I'm going to share some relatively recent work on community standards of deception, which is a project that looks at kind of what are our implicit moral rules that dictate when deception is perceived to be ethical. So typically, and this will be familiar to everyone here today, we think of honesty as good and deception as bad, right? This is an issue we're trying to fight when we do misinformation interventions and other related work. But a lot of my work is motivated by the simple idea that this is an overly simplistic kind of view of honesty and deception. And one reason, among others, that it's overly simplistic is that this view often confounds two things. So one dimension is this honesty deception dimension, the degree to which someone's words kind of depart from accuracy or truth. And that's often confounded with an orthogonal dimension of helping and harming, the degree to which someone's words help or harm other people. So if we really think about these two dimensions, it's pretty clear, right, why honesty, pro-social honesty is good and anti-social deception is bad. That's the conflict that the majority of our work examines. But my work really tries to understand, along with others, some of who are here today, how do we think about these off diagonals of pro-social deception and anti-social honesty, right? The lies we tell to protect and care for others, and the truths that we use to kind of license harm and pain. So today I'm going to talk about some work on pro-social deception, and in particular, this endeavor to figure out in everyday life, which lies do we see as pro-social? And in past work, using kind of more abstracted paradigms, I've found that lies that objectively benefit others tend to be seen as ethical. But what does that look like in everyday life? What lies in everyday life do we see as objectively benefiting others, which can help us understand, right, when is lying seen as ethical? So I started this work actually with an inductive survey with both laboratory participants and online participants, in which we're simply asking them to generate kind of their moral preferences or their preferences to be deceived. Coming up with situations in which you believe that it is right to lie, or in which you would want to be lied to yourself. And I find this approach interesting because it actually links, I think, well to this philosophical or normative test around deception, Cicely Bach's test of publicity, which, again, many people here are probably familiar with, but this famous philosophical standard suggesting that the only lies that are normatively ethical, or that could be ethical, are the ones that we could openly debate and consent to in advance. So what are the set of lies that society would mutually agree is ethical and that they would consent to be told? And so the questions asked in this inductive study speak to this standard. So in doing this, we're going to begin to unearth these systematic rules or community standards of deception, which can help us predict deceptive behavior as well as interpersonal reactions to deception. And although I am a descriptive, psychologist, I find this project particularly fun because it does begin to bridge kind of descriptive and normative ethics. All right, so I just want to start with a prototype of one of the participant responses. So this participant says, well, I would want people to lie to me only if it protected me from unnecessary pain. If I asked about the details of someone's death whom I was close to, I would want to be told that they died peacefully, even if there was much pain and suffering. In situations such as these, telling the truth would cause a lot of anguish and agony over a situation that has no available action. I would feel impotent and useless and regret knowing the truth. And so this idea of unnecessary harm or pain actually is very, very common in our lay judgments of deception. In fact, over 75% of participants justify deception and say they would want to be deceived when it prevents unnecessary harm. And it's notable that the kind of consensual response does not reflect a deontological position. So only fewer than 5% of participants say deception is always wrong, or I would never want to be deceived. And only about 40% of participants kind of engage in what I would call a broad utilitarian calculus, meaning they are saying anything about how deception affects the communicator, right? If it's good enough for the communicator, it's ethical, or society. Instead, the majority of participants are really engaging in this harm-based calculus focused on the target. How does deception affect the target? How does that influence what is acceptable? And so that begs the question, well, how exactly do we make these judgments of harm, and specifically unnecessary harm? So from this qualitative data, we can begin to map out a framework for answering this question. And what we see is that a lot of participants are weighing these two key dimensions of truth against each other. So one dimension is the instrumental value of truth. To what extent do you think someone would learn something meaningful that could lead to behavioral change from the truth? And they're weighing this against the immediate harm of truth. Will information sharing right now cause avoidable pain or suffering to the target? And so from those two dimensions, it becomes clear that for the most part, people believe you should tell the truth, right? Even if you're going to cause immense immediate harm, but that harm has instrumental value. You can learn, you can grow, you can cope with that information. People seem to perceive that as necessary harm. They believe truth telling is acceptable and ethical. But it's in this lower right-hand quadrant where lying seems ethical because the truth would cause unnecessary harm, immediate pain and suffering with no potential for growth. And so beyond this general framework, the inductive or qualitative data also highlights conditions in which this judgment of unnecessary harm is activated. For example, people talk about the fragility of the target. Right? If someone is in a compromised emotional state, sharing a difficult truth might be unnecessarily harmful. If someone can't understand the truth or is in a compromised cognitive state, right, sharing a difficult truth might be unnecessarily harmful. If this goes back to the beginning example, if there's nothing a person can do with the truth, there's no control in the situation, right? Telling that difficult truth might be unnecessarily harmful. And so in this work, I've identified kind of 8 community standards that both draw on judgments of instrumental value and immediate harm. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but it illustrates kind of the most common exemplars that come to mind that we can manipulate systematically, which I'll share with you in a moment. What I find compelling about this framework is that it's not new, right? I'm not the first to voice some of these ideas, but until recently, a lot of these different ideas and exceptions to the rule of honesty have kind of been siloed in disparate literatures, and we've lacked kind of a common framework. But just to give you some examples, read back to the Babylonian Talmud, a book of rabbinical debates in Judaism, right? The rabbis discuss that actually truths that inflict hurt, immediate harm, without achieving greater good, providing instrumental value, are forbidden. Right, Plato and Aristotle, they talk about the exceptions to honesty that are mandated when you're talking to the mentally unstable or the ill. In psychology, kind of classic research by Bella DiPaolo and others talks about kind of these two motives of communication, affective, which relates to immediate harm, and informational motives, which relate to instrumental value. We also have a lot of discussions of these types of ideas in the information avoidance literature, as well as applied ethics, right? So this isn't completely novel, right, community standards, but it's kind of a way to think about these exceptions under a common framework. So in our next part of the research, we try to manipulate these community standards of deception across different vignettes just to show kind of causal evidence, right, for this theoretical framework. And I'll just share 2 examples today. So in one of these examples, we'll call this example 1, we're going to manipulate the community standard around control. So manipulate whether honest information can be acted upon. In this particular study, imagine an employee who must deliver an important presentation. He plans on wearing his favorite suit, but the employee's colleague thinks the suit's inappropriate. So he asks, how do I look in this suit? And we manipulate whether the employee can act on the information. So he either has other suits available he can wear, or there's nothing he can do with this information. He has no other suits available to wear. So what is the ethical response when the employee asks the colleague how he looks in the suit? And the options are simply lie or tell the truth. So let me walk you through this graph. We also ask participants their judgments of the instrumental value of truth in each situation and the immediate harm of truth. And we see the gray circle here is the control and the red is the treatment. And so what we see is that, right, when someone can change their suit, yeah, it's not all that harmful to tell them it's inappropriate. It has high instrumental value. The vast majority of people think it's ethical to tell the truth. And yet, when the person cannot change, right, there's lower instrumental value, it's a little bit more harmful. And now we see the majority of people thinking the ethical response, right, is to lie. Going through another quick example, this features a man named Gregory, who is an elderly person in a nursing home. He's either in good physical and mental health, so no violation, or he lacks cognitive capacity. He has trouble understanding the truth because he suffers from dementia. So the caregiver learns that Gregory's daughter, who he's been estranged from, has passed away. And Gregory asks out of the blue, have you heard anything about my family? Again, same mechanism judgments, and I'll show you the kind of the graph in the same format here. We see, right, in the control condition, when Gregory can understand the truth, it's very painful. It's painful to know someone close to you, someone you love, has passed away. But with cognitive capacity, we can cope, we can grieve, we can understand that. Majority of people think it is ethical to tell the truth. But, right, if you lack cognitive capacity, now the majority of people think it is ethical to lie. So we've run these types of studies in lots of different situations and also experiments just directly testing the framework where we kind of describe information abstractly, right, saying that it will or will not cause severe emotional harm and a person can or cannot learn from it. And we find convergent evidence of this framework. So more recently, I've been looking to see how judgments of unnecessary harm affect the use and judgment of deception in everyday life. So for example, just having participants from a representative population think of the last time they struggled to tell the truth. They could have ended up lying or telling the truth. And so we have their ultimate decision and their judgments of various features of the situation. And we find that both the decision to lie and moral judgments of deception are predicted by these two mechanisms: perceptions of immediate harm and instrumental value. And this is above and beyond a number of other mechanisms that might come to mind, or kind of normative standards that might come to mind when we think of deception, such as how deception is seen as affecting the autonomy of the target, the societal harm of deception, the degree to which deception undermines trust, the degree to which deception furthers the communicator's self-interest, right? We see kind of some of those judgments do have predictive value, but we're seeing effects of immediate harm and instrumental value, right? This unnecessary harm beyond those mechanisms. We've also started conducting studies with physicians, right, where this is a population that struggles with this decision quite frequently, right? How to manage patient well-being and hope and balance that against truth. And we see, right, again, physicians' decisions are also predicted, and moral judgments are predicted by these two mechanisms above and beyond the ones I mentioned before. So I just want to touch on kind of where I'm going right now, because I think this will also dovetail nicely with some of the discussions of misinformation. But we're currently, right, doing bigger studies with U.S. elected officials and planning studies with public health officials and journalists to also think about kind of how the initial content or source of misinformation or incomplete information is also often motivated by desires to reduce harm, right? We saw this in the context of COVID, and we're seeing this in our early data, at least with US elected officials, right? Where a lot of the time, right, you're trying to figure out how to manage public panic, hope, and the externalities of full, complicated, and uncertain information. And so seeing how these standards and these concerns about harm play out at a larger scale is kind of where we're going. So to wrap up, we find here that deception is perceived to be moral, and I didn't focus that much on it here, but individuals also want to be deceived in these cases when it prevents unnecessary harm. We have a set of implicit rules or community standards that dictate our judgments of unnecessary harm. And kind of more broadly, right, this highlights how honesty and deception are often seen as tactics, right, communication tactics, right, not moral goods and evils in and of themselves, at least when we evaluate single situations. So I'll end there. Thanks so much, and I'm excited to take some of your questions.